to wait a couple minutes for more participants to log in. Okay, so I know folks will continue to trickle in, but as we have just a short hour, I'd like to get started. Thank you all so much for joining Stimson for today's webinar. It's my pleasure to host a team of researchers who have performed new analysis on recent public opinion surveys in Taiwan. And today they're here to share their insights on how the pandemic, the crisis in Hong Kong, and the military threat from the PRC have affected public opinion and civic action in Taiwan. I'll briefly introduce the research team before letting them take the reins. If you have a question for the Q&A session, please send it through the Q&A function, which you should see at the bottom of your screen. First, Dr. Shelley Rigger is the Brown Professor of East Asian Politics at Davidson College. She's an expert on Taiwan's domestic politics, cross-strait relations, and US-Taiwan relations, and was recently a Fulbright Senior Scholar based in Taipei. Dr. Lev Nachman is a 2019-2020 Fulbright Research Fellow in Taiwan and holds a PhD in political science at UC Irvine. His research focuses on contentious politics and contested states with a special focus on Taiwan and Hong Kong. Nathan Chen is a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellow and is also a PhD candidate in political science at UC Irvine. He's published research on political participation and public opinion of minority groups. And last but not least, John Mock is a PhD candidate in sociology at UC Irvine. His research interests include religion and ethics, culture, and political participation with a focus on Hong Kong, China, and the Catholic Church. And with that, the floor is yours, Nathan.
Thank you so much. It's a wonderful opportunity to be with you all today. So I will also want to first thank the Stimson Center for putting together this event, Pam especially for organizing everything. Hopefully one day we could kind of be all in person and to have coffee with one another in and out of the event. I guess we'll have to wait just a little bit longer, in the United States at least. And we'd also like to thank the Stimson Center for graciously funding this survey endeavor, and also to the Smith Richardson Foundation. So I'll go ahead and just introduce the survey. So Shelley, do you think you can go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So this is just a little bit of the information about the survey that we actually just completed. So the target sample that we wanted to get in terms of inferring to the population were just adults over the age of 20 in Taiwan. We were in contact with the Pulchracy Lab, and we're really grateful for their partnership on this survey research as well. And they were able to help us with some of the sampling. So we did some random sampling from a database of telephone interviews at NCCU. And at that point, respondents were then able to opt into a survey online. In terms of the participation rate, we're about 9%. And then we just completed the survey May 27th, and it was in the field for about 1 month. So just a little bit more about the breakdown of what our sample looked like. We had 1,000 respondents in Taiwan. In terms of age, party, and identity, we can kind of go through these more in depth in the question and answer. I don't want to take up too much time in this regard. But we generally have a sample that looks pretty representative to the population. We looked at what the party vote breakdown looked like in the 2020 election. It looked fairly similar, and by identity as well. Importantly, those that identify just as Taiwanese, those identified just as Chinese, and those identify as both. We have very few people in our survey that identify as just Chinese, which is reflective of what the current identity group trends look like in Taiwan. So at this point, I will go ahead and turn it over to my colleague, Lev.
Thank you, Nathan. So our underlying research kind of motivation was there are plenty of data points that we can look at over the years that indicate that sentiment towards the PRC is declining in Taiwan. And the start of our research is to look at to what degree people in Taiwan feel negatively towards the PRC, and then later on to see how recent events like Hong Kong, COVID, and recent militarization by the PRC are continuing to affect negative opinions of the PRC. So this first slide here shows breakdown by party ID. And overwhelmingly, you see a very small number of people who feel positive towards the PRC. Of course, those that do tend to be from the KMT, the more pro-China leaning party. No surprise to anyone, those who identify with the DPP overwhelmingly have negative feelings towards the PRC. But you, at the very least, to draw your attention to the number of negative and neither respondents from the KMT, another way to look at this is to say that only 20% of KMT supporters have a positive opinion of the PRC. And in actuality, a good number, a majority of KMT respondents actually don't necessarily have a positive opinion of the PRC, contrary to what we may perceive. This is the same. This is a breakdown of whether or not people see the PRC as a friend or enemy of Taiwan. And the bar on the far right shows the total sample. And then we have it broken down by age on the rest of the chart. And unsurprising, the majority of people perceive the PRC as an enemy rather than a friend. And you actually see this up all the way until the 60-plus-year-old demographic is really the only demographic that sees somewhat of a positive, friendly image of the PRC, but even that number is still below those who see it as an enemy. And this will be a reoccurring theme with a lot of our results, but just purely looking at demography, young people, younger cohorts in Taiwan hold far more negative opinions of the PRC than those 60 and over, which means as time goes on, the odds of these trends of negative perceptions of the PRC are only likely to increase. Here's the same question, but broken down by identity group. So just real quick, if you're wondering why we don't have Chinese identifiers on our graph, again, just to emphasize what Nathan said, only 1% of respondents in our survey identified as only Chinese. And that's actually very similar to kind of if you look at, say, the NCCU long-term survey, it's a similar number. And because they're just so few, we don't even include them in our analysis here. So really what you're looking at are Taiwanese identifiers and Taiwanese and Chinese identifiers. And here, again, you see that if you identify as Taiwanese, you don't see the PRC in a positive light. And that doesn't mean the opposite, that if you're Taiwanese and Chinese, you do see them in a positive light. The majority of Taiwanese or people who identify as Taiwanese and Chinese still hold somewhat negative feelings towards the PRC. Only 25% of people who identify as both see it as a friend of Taiwan, and a smaller number see it as a positive. So now we move to China's impact on Taiwan, whether the impact is positive or negative. And again, on the far right, it has our entire sample and then broken down again by age. And this looks very similar to the last age breakdown that you just saw, where again, the vast majority of cohorts see China's impact on Taiwan as a negative. It really is only the 60-plus-year-old cohort that sees China's impact as somewhat positive. But again, that positive number is about equal to the negative number. So again, overwhelmingly, we see across cohorts fairly negative opinions of the PRC. Now here we have an interesting question that looks at cultural similarities. And I don't want to steal John's thunder too much because he's about to get into our Hong Kong data. But what's interesting about this graph is that people have more similar sentiment towards Chinese culture than they do Hong Kong culture. Now, that's not to say that people don't feel similar towards Hong Kong as well. You still see 42% feel similar to Hong Kong, but the 56% number that was larger goes to China. And the next chart here shows that broken down by age. And this is particularly interesting because in light of every graph we've seen up until this point, we would assume that people have very negative opinions of the PRC in China, and yet they're able to at least acknowledge or feel some sort of sentiment that shows cultural similarities to China. And so what this really seems to tell us is that what Taiwanese cohorts are rejecting is the PRC, not Chinese culture or some sort of a defined version of what Chineseness means. Of course, the PRC is trying to define that themselves, and that's what Taiwanese people are rejecting. But there's definitely a difference to be seen in terms of rejecting Chineseness and rejecting China, the PRC. And with that, I will pass it on to my colleague, John.
Yeah, thank you, Lev. So our survey also wants to understand how Taiwan people really think about Hong Kong. I mean, from media reports, from online opinions, it seems that Taiwan people in general support Hong Kong, right? But our findings somehow complicates the picture a bit. So we will now show you some of our findings. First of all, we would like to know whether Taiwan people support the anti-extradition movement in 2019. And this is not surprising. So overall, around 60% of the respondents say yes. So they somehow support the movement. But then if we ask them by party identification, then the picture is much more complicated, even though it's not surprising, right? So for people identified with the DPP, 90% of them support the movement. But for people who identified with KMT, it's less than 25%. And also by age group, again, not surprising, you can see that young people in general are much more supportive of the movement. Even though, well, at this point, we can't tell what do they think when we ask whether they support the movement or not, because there are many ways to support the movement, but then still in general, we can see young people are more supportive, right? And then we want to go to some deeper questions. So we would like to know whether Taiwan people think they have the responsibility to assist Hong Kongers. Somehow being supportive is very different from thinking that I have a responsibility, right? And here we can see a more complicated picture. So we ask the respondents whether they think they have the responsibility or not. And then you can see only around 30% of the respondents responded yes, while also around 30% said no. And then about 40% of them said neither. So we can say that Taiwan people are somewhat ambivalent when we talk about responsibility to assist Hong Kongers. And then also by group identity, again, we take away people who identify themselves as only Chinese because there's only 1% of them. So, but then we can see somehow quite logical that people who identify themselves as only Taiwanese, 34% of them say they have the responsibility, while people who think they are both Taiwanese and Chinese, they're 23%. But then in general, the percentage is not that high, right? Yeah. And then we move on to another perspective, is to understand Taiwan people support for certain policies that are related to Hong Kong. First, we would like to know whether they think the current policies of the Taiwanese government, do they think the government is doing enough? And we can see somehow, again, an ambivalent picture. 30% say yes, 30% say no, and then another 40% say neither. And this is, I think, a very interesting finding. So we kind of break down different policies. We ask our respondents to think whether they think, first of all, Hong Kongers who have migrated to Taiwan and stayed long enough have the right to vote, whether Hong Kongers have the right to migrate to Taiwan, and whether Hong Kongers have the right to purchase housing. Interestingly, even though there are only 30, well, I shouldn't say only, but then there are 36% of Taiwan people who think that Hong Kongers have the right to migrate to Taiwan. But 43% of those respondents think that as long as you Hong Kongers, those Hong Kongers who have migrated here and then stayed long enough, they should have the right to vote. I think this is very interesting because we can say that it seems that Taiwan people take political rights very seriously, right? At least from this finding. And then we kind of break down by party identification. So again, for the DPP, people who identified with the DPP, 40% of the respondents say that they support Hong Kong's migration to Taiwan, while for the KMT, only 22%. But this is very interesting again. For the support for voting rights for Hong Kongers who have migrated to Taiwan and stayed long enough, no matter whether you identified with KMT or whether you identified with the DPP, around 43 to 44% of the respondents think that they should have the right to vote. So I guess we can have a somewhat tentative summary, a conclusion about that. So many people would say they don't think Hong Kongers should migrate to have the right to migrate to Taiwan. But as long as you are here and you stay long enough, then you should have the right to vote. So maybe there's kind of civic nationalism here, right? So somewhat not very welcoming, but if you're one of us, then you should have the right to vote. And then I give the stage back to Lev to talk about the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you, John. Obviously, the current COVID situation in Taiwan is not great, but thankfully, the last few days, trends seem to be going back down a little bit. So we're a little bit hopeful, at least watching Taiwan from afar. We're curious about kind of two, if you can go to the next slide, please, Shelley. We're curious about two things here with these set of questions. People's response to Taiwan's COVID response, and then people's response to the PRC's response. And it's worth noting that, as Nathan showed at the very beginning, our survey actually spanned from before the spike and after the COVID spike. And we haven't done a whole lot of checks, but some of our early stats tests show that there was not a major difference between those who responded before or after the COVID spike. So what this story here shows us is something very interesting. 61% of KMT supporters support the Taiwanese government's response. They are still the biggest do not support group as well. But what this shows to me is that there was far more bipartisan support for the Taiwanese government's COVID response than maybe some of the KMT news talking heads would like us to believe. And that even though there are plenty of KMT supporters who do not support the Taiwanese government's COVID response, there is still far more support across party lines, even after the pandemic spike, than we might necessarily assume. Now, on the right is that same survey, just broken down by party ID. And then on the left is approval of the PRC's response to the COVID pandemic. And unsurprisingly, the largest number of approve come from the KMT in terms of people who see the PRC's response in a positive light. And again, on the right, you see actually a similar number of KMT respondents also supporting the Taiwanese government's response to COVID. But in terms of the PRC's response, you see much lower support from most other parties, the exception being the Taiwan People's Party, which is the Mayor Taipei Ko-Wen-je's political party, which tends to lean pan-blue. And this isn't particularly surprising in the sense that if you have slightly pro-China leanings, then you may be a little bit more sympathetic to the PRC's COVID response during the pandemic. The silver lining, for us at least, is that those who are sympathetic to the PRC's response do not do so at the expense of being sympathetic to the Taiwanese government's COVID response at the same time. Now, this looks at whether or not COVID has changed your opinion towards the PRC. Here, I mean, I'll start on the far right. No one's really improved their image of the PRC since the pandemic. A number of people who identify as both Taiwanese and Chinese see their image improved, but the far majority of people who identify as Taiwanese and Chinese, their opinion of the PRC has stayed the same. 61% of people who identify as only Taiwanese now feel worse about the PRC after the pandemic than before. And with those who identify as Taiwanese, that number continuing to grow, this again just feeds into a further downward trend of Taiwanese people having more negative opinions of the PRC, especially post-pandemic. Here again is your opinion of the PRC post-pandemic broken down by age and by party ID. Unsurprising, the majority of people who identify who have better opinions come from more pan-blue parties. So the KMT, the New Party, and the People's First Party have somewhat better views of the PRC, but the number of respondents for those last two on the far right were much smaller than the KMT. Overwhelmingly, you see much more unchanged views. And even when you look at whether or not COVID has made your opinion of China better or worse by age breakdown, it again is really only people 60 and older that have over 10% of better, but even that number still is largely more unchanged than it is better. Now, finally, we're going to talk about recent PRC military pressure on Taiwan and what effect that has. And the kind of our motivation behind these sets of questions as well is another common wisdom talking point you hear is that people in Taiwan are fairly ambivalent towards military threats. Or that they don't know about them, they don't care. And we were curious to see to what degree that's true, or to what degree people in Taiwan actually are cognizant of increased military pressure. So here's the number that looks at whether or not you're worried that there will be a cross-strait war. And only 20% of people are not worried, which is a much more reassuring number than I think a lot of us would have anticipated. Now, don't get me wrong, 23% say neither worried nor not worried. But at the very least, that sort of at least tells us that they're aware, but that it doesn't particularly bother them, which seems to be, fairly, at least from my own experience, accurate in the sense that military pressure has become so normalized that for a lot of people in Taiwan, they're aware that it's happening, but it doesn't particularly stress them out or cause them anxiety. And yet the yes number is much larger than we originally anticipated, with 57% of people who do worry that there could be a war between the PRC and Taiwan. Here's that same number broken down by age. And this is perhaps the most interesting result from the sets of questions, because this is a pretty standard result across age groups. Young people, almost all are at 55%, young from 20 to 50, all about 55% are worried, and only around 20% are not worried. And older groups are more worried, slightly more worried than younger people, but still the consistency of responses for potential worry of war between the two sides across age demographics was very interesting to us. Here's that same number by party ID breakdown. And what's interesting here is that the KMT identifiers are more worried about potential war than the DPP are. This is interesting because this may help us better understand why perhaps some KMT supporters are still inclined to push for perhaps warmer relations with the PRC in order to be some sort of deterrent for potential conflict. But of course, to really understand this number, we would need further survey work on KMT supporters to understand why it is they feel this way. And similarly to DPP supporters, it's surprising to see the DPP identifiers have a good number less of worry for war than KMT supporters. So just to quickly go over our findings with our survey. So as you've seen from pretty much every graph, young people do not see the PRC in a positive light. And this trend is continuing. And as time goes on, the number of cohorts who hold these negative views towards the PRC are only likely to grow. When it comes to support for Hong Kong, the way that we summarize our findings is that there's a vaguely positive ambivalence towards Hong Kongers, in the sense that people aren't overwhelmingly against Hong Kongers being in Taiwan, but the vast majority of respondents feel somewhat ambivalent towards whether or not Taiwan needs to be doing more to help Hong Kongers, with a slightly more positive trend when it comes to certain policy questions. When it comes to COVID, Taiwanese people do not particularly buy the PRC's propaganda that they've done a particularly good job. And the vast majority of them actually now have more negative opinions of the PRC after COVID. The KMT, the KMT, arguing that the DPP has failed and done a bad job with its COVID response, shows that KMT identifiers don't necessarily agree with that, and that KMT identifiers actually have a much more positive opinion of Tsai's COVID response than we would initially perceive. Taiwanese are much more aware of potential military threats than I think common wisdom would tell us, which is a comforting thing to know, at the very least, that Taiwanese are more aware of increased military pressure than before. And overall, all of these different questions, whether they are the ongoing issue, the Hong Kong crisis, COVID, and military pressure, are further pushing Taiwanese sentiment towards the PRC down. And as these kind of civil society perceptions and relations break down, it only causes potential for further deterioration between the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. And thank you very much for your attention. We most certainly welcome any and all questions.
Myself. Thank you so much. That is a really wonderful presentation. So much really fascinating data about how Taiwanese have been so affected by the confluence of these situations over the past few years, especially during the pandemic. I will start off as moderator with the first question. Taking more of a policy view, so the G7 leaders communique that you saw released just last week took a really unprecedented step of emphasizing peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait and also peaceful resolution of cross-strait issues, which is an important sign of unity from the G7 states on Taiwan. But given that Taiwanese are so concerned about a war across the strait, how would you say that the US and other partners of Taiwan should be interpreting these findings and trends in their approach to Taiwan and cross-strait issues?
Well, I can say a little bit about US policy, and thank you very much, Nathan, John, and Lev. That was fantastic. And Pam, I just want to note that they managed to do that in less than 30 minutes, which is probably the only speaker you've ever had that actually finished under time. We did ask some questions specifically about US policy and whether or not the general approach that the US is taking is whether or not Taiwanese are supportive of the general approach that the US is taking. So, for example, when the US uses military, diplomatic, and economic pressure to influence the PRC, is this good for Taiwan or bad for Taiwan? And just adding the numbers in my head as I look at them, about 65%-ish, a little bit less than that, maybe 62% say it's good for Taiwan. Or say it is either good for Taiwan or neither good nor bad. So 40% say it's good for Taiwan when the US pressures China, and another 20% say not sure. So there's strong support, I would say, or there's reasonable support for a US policy on that front. And then as for US military activities in the region, and we specifically prompted them to think about naval transits, again, 45% say these are beneficial to Taiwan. The question where there was a little bit more ambivalence was, is great power competition between the US and China conducive to stability in the region? And there was, sort of a plurality saying yes, but it was a much more even distribution. So what I would take away from that is that the direct support that the US gives to Taiwan is recognized as beneficial to Taiwan. But the idea of great power competition between the US and China makes some people nervous.
Thank you, Shelley. Anything y'all want to add? Lev, Jason, or Lev, John, Nathan?
I would just add that seeing a unified message from G7, I think at the very least offers additional assurance. Obviously, the US support for Taiwan is the fundamental partnership, but Taiwan needs more friends and allies than just the US, and being able to show a unified front from multiple countries, I think at the very least shows more assurance that there are other states besides the US invested in maintaining peace in the cross-strait.
Yeah, and just one more point on that. This seems to be perhaps a policy shift from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. So it's not just the G7. The Biden administration also got a similar statement from the Japanese government, and that is the first time since the Nixon era that Japan has been willing to kind of put Taiwan into its statement with the US. So I think what we see is the Biden administration's return to multilateralism, and it was not necessarily the case that the Biden administration would incorporate Taiwan into its multilateral initiatives. So I think that's quite an interesting development.
We're getting some really good questions that are kind of similar, so I'll ask to feed into the conversation. Cameron Waltz asks us if there's any indication that sentiment in Taiwan towards the US has changed between the Trump and Biden administrations. And he notes that there were initial misgivings that Biden would be soft on China. What do you think about that?
So I can speak briefly to that. There most certainly was initial hesitations because the relationship between the US and Taiwan under the Trump administration was very warmly welcomed in Taiwan, that there was worry that there was not going to be a continuity of that relationship in the transition to Biden. And I think that people are much more at ease after seeing what Secretary of State Blinken has done so far. And I think that people most certainly feel at ease seeing things like a return to multilateralism with the G7 statement. Now, in terms of sorry, just give me just 1 second. Shelley, can you jump in?
Yeah, we didn't survey, we didn't include questions about the US policy other than the three that I just mentioned. But I do think it's taking a while to kind of sink in. I mean, the the Trump wave in Taiwan was really strong leading into the election. So, you know, many people are having to revise their judgment to recognize that the Biden administration is not really changing its policy. So I think this would be a really interesting question to ask in another few months when the things like the US donation of vaccine to Taiwan, the visit of the 3 US senators to announce that the US was going to, you know, these things need to kind of percolate through because to be honest, the US presidential election was quite politicized in Taiwan as well, with the Green camp, not the DPP or the Tsai government. So the DPP as a party and Tsai as a president and her administration on the whole, really, I think, tried hard to distance themselves from this narrative that, you know, Trump is our friend and Biden's going to be bad for Taiwan. But it was that narrative was very strong on the Green side. So I don't know that we would be able to see it now. So I'm actually mostly deferring to Lev, who's just returned in the last couple of days from Taiwan to think about that from the point of view of the sort of broad conversation rather than specific data that we have.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up. There's most certainly a much more positive attitude towards Biden than there was 6 months ago. And there actually is a very good survey done by Pew in 2019 that actually asked Taiwanese opinions of the United States. And I think that's a really valuable kind of Trump era data point. But I really hope that Pew repeats that same survey during Biden's time to really see whether or not there's been a change in support for US-Taiwan relations in Taiwan. But just anecdotally amongst my own friends who follow Taiwanese friends who follow American politics, a lot of the hesitation that they felt 6 months ago is gone, thankfully.
I will include another question about the US policy before we shift over to some Hong Kong related questions. Eric Lee asks, you mentioned that only 20% of people are not worried about Chinese military pressure, and those who responded with yes are consistent across age groups. Do you believe that this opinion is affected by the recent debates in the US about strategic ambiguity?
So strategic ambiguity is a really kind of controversial thing in Taiwan, because for a lot of Taiwanese people, they would much prefer the U.S. Openly say that they will have their back in the event of a conflict. And we didn't ask any questions on strategic ambiguity, but it will certainly be an interesting question to ask in the future. Whether or not strategic ambiguity or the discussions about changing it or not changing it are affecting whether or not Taiwanese people are more nervous about conflict, I think is an interesting question, but I think it's definitely something that would need to be kind of further investigated.
There's been some really great recent research that I would direct the questioner to, a study by Ian Johnston and George Yin and some other people looking specifically, doing a kind of survey experiment to see how different US responses and also how the conflict might begin affect people's willingness to take up arms in the defense of Taiwan. And their findings are kind of ambiguous for strategic ambiguity, because what they find is that Taiwanese who are highly confident or more confident that the US would intervene to defend Taiwan are more willing than also to use their own resources and bodies to defend Taiwan. At the same time, though, if that feels like an unconditional commitment, then they're also more likely to support Taiwan independence. So the value of strategic ambiguity as a sort of dual deterrent, deterring the PRC from attacking Taiwan, but also deterring Taiwanese from imagining that they have a kind of carte blanche to take action that would be very likely, we assess, to provoke a military attack from Taiwan, that dual deterrence seems to still be working. So I think the challenge for the US is how do we ensure that Taiwanese feel confident that the US is invested without creating that unconditional guarantee.
Thank you. We have a number of questions on Hong Kong, so I will try to group them together. Let's start with Lucy Nib's question on Taiwanese responses towards the Hong Kong issues. Is it possible that there are more ambivalent responses because of a lack of policy awareness, or people feeling that they don't have adequate knowledge of the situation? If not, what do you think the high number of neutral responses really speaks to?
So that's an interesting question, because the entire DPP's policy since it brought in the Hong Kong policy has been to be fairly loud about it. The grand opening of the Humanitarian Response Center, I mean, even during the 2020 election, the DPP was incredibly vocal about supporting Hong Kong, that there's been all these kind of media narratives that there's this deeply felt love and support of Hong Kongers amongst Taiwan. And our survey results show that that's not entirely true, that people don't not love Hong Kongers. It's just that people don't particularly feel that kind of big love and support that the DPP has kind of been describing.
Yeah, right. I think there are actually similar questions, so maybe I may also be answering them. But it's easier to say you support the movement against China, Hong Kong or not, right? Because if it is like Macau, I guess Taiwan people in general also support the movement because they see that as I believe they see that as a resistance against the expansion of authoritarian China. However, when it comes to, say, policies, then those are, let's say, more complicated issues, because we need to think whether the policies are good or not, whether the policy would affect myself or not. So I think it is quite understandable that people are much more ambivalent about that. And then actually we also ask some related questions. We say, for example, we ask whether Taiwan people have favorable opinions towards Hong Kongers as a group. And then again, actually the result is quite ambivalent. Only 30% of the respondents say yes, favorable, but around 60% say neither favorable or not favorable. So this gives us a feeling that it's more about against China rather than having strong linked fate with Hong Kongers or support Hong Kongers as Hong Kongers. Right, but of course this is a survey, and then we don't have qualitative data. But then it's kind of our let's say informed guess.
John, that's a really good point. Melissa Newcomb also asked why Taiwanese seem ambivalent about helping Hong Kongers in direct ways, such as the migration to Taiwan. Does that sort of fit in with that narrative of just concern about the PRC reaction to those policies?
Right. So I think this is somewhat a similar situation. So when we're talking about supporting a movement, it's easier to say yes or no. It's a political stance, clear political stance. But then when we're talking about migration, there are much more considerations, right? Where they will get employment, whether they will be affecting our economic lives. And then, right, so I guess, even if it's not Taiwan, when we talk about, say, Britain or whatever, I somehow believe that the situation would be quite similar. So the responses would be more ambivalent.
We have some other findings in our survey that look at, and John included one of them, things like, do you feel that Hong Kongers coming to Taiwan will increase the odds of CCP infiltration? Or will essentially asking, do you think Hong Kongers will be spies if we let them in? And we see very high numbers thinking that that's true. And again, with the housing number that John showed earlier, the fact that so many people are against housing, about a year ago, and this really was a hot topic discussed in civil society in Taiwan, the biggest reasons why Taiwanese people were saying we don't want Hong Kongers here would reference fears of infiltration, and worrying about kind of economic loss through housing. So essentially, they didn't want rich Hong Kongers coming to Taiwan and buying up all the houses. Those reasons to them feel justified, but that's a very different kind of reaction to this kind of general sentiment, like John was talking about, of course we love and support the Hong Kong protesters, just kind of from far away.
And we did actually have a question specifically on Melissa's question about the likelihood that being very welcoming to Hong Kongers might cause the PRC to attack Taiwan, right, to raise the threat level. And 40% not neither, so falling into the same pattern, but a significantly larger share said, no, that's not, letting in Hong Kongers is not going to cause the PRC to attack us. So those who said maybe it would were about 21 plus about 25%. Those who said probably it wouldn't were about 34%. So, I don't think there's a widespread conviction that if we let the Hong Kongers in, that China's going to attack us, but people are thinking about that. And what they're really thinking about is infiltration in the form of spies, because we asked that question directly, as Lev said, and that one was pretty high.
Continuing on that theme of worry over the threat of war, Ryan Loomis asks, basically, is this a partisan issue? He asks, is the DPP leadership making an effort to increase the sense of concern over conflict among their supporters, and possibly is like KMT media maybe doing the opposite, perhaps, or perhaps because the KMT does have a pretty high worry about this threat as well, is the KMT criticizing Tsai's policies as increasing the threat of war?
So actually, during Tsai's second inauguration speech last year, one of her main points and goals of her second term was to try to increase the military's presence in civil society and increase civil society's perception of the military. Because in Taiwan, the military is seen as a largely blue organization, and there's kind of a sense of distrust among green identifiers towards the Taiwanese military. And ever since then, just in like the last year, there have been advertisements for the military on buses and, portrayals of soldiers as these big heroic figures defending Taiwan. So, it's interesting because Tsai is making a major concerted effort, and there's been some policy changes as well to try to increase military budgets. She's making a major effort to try to change this perception that the military does matter and that we need to be, more ready. Our survey shows that that's maybe not kicking in quite yet. But at the very least, it's not that the DPP is not trying to change that awareness. I think it's just a matter of lagging behind Tsai's actions to when we're going to actually see kind of a reflection of that within civil society.
We also had a similar question or a related question from Mahima Dougal. Did you find if people are supportive of the Taiwanese government's strategy in response to Chinese gray zone tactics, or was that not part of the survey questions?
I don't think we asked anything in particular about gray zone tactics, but please correct me if I'm wrong.
Okay, so I have a question here from Dr. Andrew Oros. He is asking about the age variation in some of the responses. So perhaps you can touch on this, whatever topic you would like to look at. He's looking at this as a generational experience as opposed to the actual age cohorts. And he asked for comments on the age variations, especially since Taiwan is about to experience rapid aging due to its low birth rate.
Yes, thank you for that. Generational politics is something that I'm really interested in Taiwan, and trying to understand where the sort of cut points for generations should be. And I have another project ongoing now on Taiwanese youth attitudes toward a variety of things using a qualitative research method, so focus group interviews. So, you know, that you've hit the soft part of my heart with this question. I think I will certainly look at this data with generational cohorts in mind and move, you know, see how that changes things. One of the things that really strikes me here, though, is that my previous work on generational politics would have put the middle-aged people, so those sort of more in their 30s and 40s, I would have guessed that they would be more favorably inclined, that their sentiment toward the PRC would have been a little bit more positive. So when I did focus group interviews with young people, so 18 to 30 in 2019, there was very little love for mainland China there. There were still respondents who said, you know, I would like to go to the PRC, to the mainland, to develop my career, but there was just a lot more negativity about that than I had seen when I did the same kind of research back in 2006. So in 2006, people in their 20s said, you know, ideally, I'd like to go to the West, but my second choice would be Taiwan, to be able to stay here. But if I can't get the job I want, it would be exciting to go to the mainland. And there's a lot of stuff for us to do over there. The best characterization came from a young man who said, you know, Taiwan, the mainland it's neither a threat nor an opportunity for us. It's an opportunity full of threats, and it's a threat full of opportunities. Today's youth, or the ones I talked to in 2019, overwhelmingly see threat rather than opportunity. And what surprised me in our research this time was it seems like the middle generation, those in their 20s and 30s, so the people I talked to, you know, 15 years ago, are also more negative. So we are not necessarily fully in a kind of life cycle, or maybe we are seeing a life cycle effect rather than a cohort effect. So there's a lot to unpack here that I have not even started to think about because this data is so new. But I do think it has the potential to yield some interesting insights. And what I would just note from it is that what I expected to see, which was sort of higher levels of favorability in the middle age groups, is not in our survey.
So another question asks to slice and dice by party affiliation. Chuck Wooldridge asks, he says that the KMT or the pan-blue support seems to be a bigger tent. The blue supporters have greater variation in their impressions of the PRC. And do you think that this will be helpful to the KMT as it sort of reinvents itself, trying to regain power? And do you think that there are any ethnic differences that were not encountered in the survey, particularly Hakka?
So that's a great question. And as we approach the KMT's new leadership election in just a couple of months, I think we are all eager to see how the party tries to reinvent itself. But the observation is totally correct. There is far more variation among pan-blue respondents than there are pan-green respondents. And you know what this really shows is just a major split within the KMT about those who feel kind of the quintessential connection to China, regardless of whether or not it's the PRC or not, and those that feel a connection to China, but not the PRC. It would be really interesting to do a closer look of just pan-blue supporters to see which numbers are growing, because based off of the number of KMT supporters who are under the age of 40, and there are some, they tend to have a much more positive opinion of China as a concept and entity, but not necessarily the PRC. But what I think our survey results can, at the very least, show is complicating this idea that just because you're a KMT supporter means that you want unity with you want to unify with the PRC immediately. We show that's not necessarily true.
just to quickly answer the question about Hakka, we had 86 Hakka identifiers in our sample. So that is probably enough to do some work on the Chinese identifiers. That's not enough people. 11 people is not a statistic. You can't get statistical significance for that. But I think the 86, and Nathan is nodding, so Nathan knows these things. So we may be able to do some work on Hakka versus other subethnic groups in Taiwan, or ethnic groups in Taiwan. A couple of things that I just want to note about our survey that made me really happy. One is that we had 18 indigenous respondents, which it's hard to get indigenous respondents in a survey. So that's not a very large number, but at least they were their voices in our work. And then we had 7 people who called themselves new residents of Taiwan from the PRC, and 3 who called themselves foreign new residents of Taiwan. All of our respondents had to have voting privileges in Taiwan in order to continue the survey. So what you see is this tiny little, maybe the tip of the iceberg for the future of immigration in Taiwan, where people actually see themselves as new, as meaningfully connected to Taiwan, even though they were born somewhere else. And then the last thing I want to say is we asked the question, this is a question that I've never done a survey before. I know some of the people who are on this call, and you know that I'm not very good at figuring out all that stuff. So I've been so grateful to have these guys, especially Nathan and John, working with us, allowing me to piggyback on this survey work that they're doing. But one of the questions that I've always wanted to ask in a survey and never been able to is, does the whole Waishengren, Benshengren, the whole Mainlander Taiwanese or 49er native Taiwanese, does that matter to you? And 94% of our people said, no, this does not matter. So I think one of the things that this survey does for me is it allows me to confirm something that I've felt for a long time, which is that Taiwanese people do not care about whether when your family arrived in Taiwan anymore. That's just not important to people. And I think that's good news.
So we are approaching just the last 90 seconds or so. Any last thoughts from Lev, John, Nathan, Shelley?
I did see someone ask if this is published yet, and no, not yet, but everything that we have talked about and much more will be coming out in the form of various publications over the next few months. So by all means, please stay tuned, because you will get to see the full breakdown of all of this and more.
Program your computer to look for these names, to pop them up when something is published.
Yeah, I think we can keep paying attention to the dynamics between Hong Kong and Taiwan. I think we are probably the first to do that, right? I'm not sure, but then very interesting findings.
Yeah, I'll say that, like, I guess as a kind of like a final thought, a lot of this in terms of the Hong Kong stuff is really important. I think especially because some of our also previous work serving Hong Kongers has found that in light of a lot of this extradition movement thing, a lot of kind of growing desire to kind of move out of Hong Kong and emigrate out of Hong Kong is really important in Taiwan, because Hong Kongers claim that Taiwan was the first destination they wanted to kind of go to relative to a lot of other countries. I'll go ahead and put the link to some of our findings that we published in Foreign Policy. So I'll go ahead and put that in the chat too.
I muted myself. Thank you so much for joining us today, all 4 of you. This has been a really great conversation. I think I speak for everyone in the audience as well when I say we're really looking forward to reading your analysis coming out over the next few months. This is going to be really helpful for understanding how Taiwan has been changing over the past few years, but especially in 2020. Thank you also to all the attendees for joining us today. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question. There were a lot in the Q&A chat box, so thank you for participating. And with that, Thank you. We've hit the top of the hour.